Milang, goeiemorgen, Sari Bonani, and good morning. It sounds like we could be on an SAA flight, although SAA, like the SABC, are currently waiting for government to bail them out. The question is, how do we make sure that community radio doesn't get themselves into the same position, but continues with the language and the fabric of the communities across South Africa? Welcome to the session brought to you by Arena Holdings. My name is Tim Zunkel. For purposes of this conversation, I'm an independent media consultant. I do a variety of training across Africa. And as a caveat to this, and a side note to let you know that I'm also the acting station manager of a community radio station in Cape Town until the end of September. I've got a fantastic panel joining me this morning as we talk about the community radio industry. But before we get to them, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're talking about the community radio industry, but we can't include all the players. So to this note, I must acknowledge that we don't have anyone from the National Association of Broadcasters, the National Community Radio Forum, the South African Community Radio Organization, and the South African Community Radio Forum or Foundation. We also don't have anyone from the Department of Communications, nor do we have someone from the regulator, ICASA. We do, however, have Rolene Potgieter, who is the station manager of Groot FM in Tshwane, Pretoria. Trinity Mohlame joins us as the director of the Media Connection, a specialist media sales house who work quite closely with the community radio sector. Zukisa Potya also joins us. She's the CEO of the Mdda, who are basically the funding arm attached to the Department of Communications. And lastly, Gordon Miller also joins us. Gordon's a media specialist, and community radio would have come up on his planning schedule many times. So thank you to all the panelists for joining us. We are live on Facebook and on YouTube. If you have any questions, do pop them into the comment section. I understand that this conversation is going to be robust. To the panelists, we're going to ask them to keep the answers to the point, and to the people watching us out there in South Africa who are supporters of community radio, enthusiasts and professionals in the sector, do ask your questions. We hope to try and cover as much ground in the next hour as possible. In my opinion, there's 6 S's in community radio. One of them being Centec, one of them being SAMRO, one of them being the South African Radio Service, one of them being the sales houses that sell them, the other one being the SABC, and the last one being themselves. The SABC has asked government for 3 billion rand in bailout money. And so, Kiswa, before I go to you, I was thinking to myself, there's roughly about 250 community radio stations on air, give or take a couple who are on temporary events licenses, and some of them have been taken off the air. Community radio in the 25 years that I've been associated with the industry has always had a financial problem. So I thought if we were to take 1 billion rand and cut it in half and make it 500 million rand, and we were to give each community radio station 2 million rand as a once-off gratitude, do you think it would make a difference? And potentially you could start off by giving us your snapshot of what the industry looks like at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you and good morning, colleagues. We currently have 264 community radio stations licensed in South Africa. And of those, the Mdda has funded about 157, but we've got about 12 that are off air. They're currently not broadcasting. Look, the sector struggles with, it's got problems with sustainability, and I think it's something that we've been seeing in the sector. And so we're in a process as the Mdda to actually develop a sustainability models through a research that we'll conduct in this year. But if we go to the current challenges also, I think you have mentioned things like SAMRO, they owe Centec. The sector is highly regulated. They struggle with governance and compliance issues. And those are the things that the Mdda actually assists with through our training interventions, coaching and mentorship. We've got SLAs with institutions like SIDA and others to assist us with other interventions that we can't. But to be honest, the sector is really struggling. And without the intervention from government, the sector will struggle even more. But if you talk about the bailout of the SABC and us getting perhaps that money, look, we're not competing with the SABC. SABC is one of our funders. The Mdda, when it was established by government, but with in partnership with major broadcasters and major print houses. And those broadcasters are still doing good to their name, and SABC is one of them. Annually, we get about 55 million from broadcasters, about 33 million from government, and the community broadcasters get money from the broadcasters entirely, not from government. Money from government goes partly to the print, community print and small commercial print.
Gordon, we touched very briefly on the challenges of the sector, one of them being the South African Revenue Service. Why is it that community radio stations, when they're getting sold, have to give as much discount to government bodies as they have to, when government doesn't give them any discount? From a Mdda buying perspective, Gordon, and your time in agencies, what's your impression of the sector, specifically around financing and their relationship with media agencies and buying houses?
Yeah, that's a multi-layered question. You know, I think there are a number of challenges which face the sector, and some of those, or not some of those, you know, pertain to costing. So, I mean, if I'm working as a media planner and I'm costing, you know, on behalf of a client, an outcome, I'll put in the cost of a spot, I'll put in the size of the audience, and I'll compute a value. But the biggest challenge that the community radio sector faces right now is that at a macro drone level, if you look at the establishment survey and PAMS, they'll tell us that collectively an awful lot of people listen to community radio. But when I break that down to the functional level, which is audience, the answer comes back zero. So we have the bizarre situation of a station like Hot, which I think won the most loyal listeners award on the Radio Awards, and a whole bunch of other finalists in the most votes under my station. I think it was won by Ligwala, but I'll come back to that point as well. But if I look at each of those stations individually, there's no audience. So you can't discount zero. You know, that's the problem. Until such time as we create a proper audience measure for community-based stations, the concept of a discount doesn't exist. It's how much are you prepared to pay for an empty packet of crisps? You know that's the reality of the whole thing. So we've got to take a look at it against that backdrop. What kind of audience are we going to put in play? And also, I think we just need to redefine the concept of community as well. I mean, I would argue that ultimately the most viable community communication of the lot right now during lockdown is probably WhatsApp. You know, I define my community. So there's a whole bunch of other things which are feeding off the concept of community. We need to broaden that. But the real issue when it comes to costing, whether it's government ads or agency ads, and you can market as much as you want, but if I go into my computational process and I discover you don't have an audience, that's crazy. And here's the sad part. We've not progressed since, you know, on this issue since the commencement of Radio Awards. I think we discussed it in a previous webinar. The very first People Station Award did not go, as I suspected it would, to Ukhozi FM, because they had 6-7 million listeners back, you know, 10 years ago. It actually went eventually to a station called Ubushli Bishawi, which is the station in Ishawi. And if you've ever been to Ishawi, you kind of blink and you're through, you know, through the other side. So I always pose the question, how is it possible that a station, even 10 years ago, with no listeners whatsoever, was able to win the People's Award? And here I am seeing it again. Most of the nominees on the loyal, you know, the loyal listeners and most votes for my station are community stations. But if I look at them, they have no listeners. There's a mystery there.
I think Gordon makes a very interesting point. The numbers people from the BRC aren't in the room to talk about community radio. And Raleen, that must be an issue for a station like yours. You know you've got listeners. You can see the interaction. Your clients tell you that when they run advertising, it works, but you don't come up on the numbers. As the station manager of a relatively well-run station in Pretoria that's got a rich history of more than 20 years, what's your current position and what's your feeling towards community radio as a sector?
Yeah, Tim, just to hear Gordon say that he's looking at numbers. In the first month of lockdown, 28 days, our reach as a community radio station on social media, we had 1.4 million reach worth of shares on social media. But if you look at our BRC measurements and what they say, how many listeners we have, it's between 40 and 50,000 listeners. So that really can't be true. So I think that the first point I want to make is that the way they measure a community radio station is definitely, we need to look at that, but because it's definitely, it's impossible to have with an audience of 40,000 or 35,000, it differs with every section to reach so many people on social media. But the truth is we don't have that broad audiences like the commercial radio stations. But what makes community radio stations so special is that you really speak to your listeners' heart, your audience's heart. You really connect with them in a way that's different with a broader audience. It's a niche market, and you know how to communicate with them. And we're really closer and in tune with our listeners at the community radio station. And that's why clients campaigns on air really does well, is because we know how to structure it, what to say to our audiences, because it's a niche market and we're very up close and personal with our audiences and our listeners.
I think some community radio stations would find a station like Groot enviable, that you've got people listening, you've got the tools for engagement, but that you come up on the BRC ramp. Trinity, I mean, a lot of the radio stations that you work with, because of the way that the sampling is done, don't even come up in any of the audience numbers, yet you have an entire business which in many instances supports the community radio sector to be viable. Your current position on where the sector sits and what the future looks like, please.
Tim, thank you, and thank you to everybody, and also hello to all the stations that are picking up the feed right now, and everybody else who's got access to this feed. What Gordon and Rolin said forms part of the bigger part when you talk sustainability of stations, because you can't give what you don't have. You know, you are not able to sell a station with no numbers. But I think the reason why somehow the Media Connection has been able to sustain itself and stations for more than 21 years is because we only don't sell stations by their numbers. We sell communities and insights. And as a result of this, I'm going to just make an example. If we were had to look at things by number-driven proposals, then why would KFC, Chicken Lick and Engine Garage have their outlets in communities? If the numbers were the issue, then they wouldn't have been sustained themselves in those years that they've been in these communities. I think the sampling, how it's done, has got a lot of opportunities for improvement. Because a bulk of the numbers that come out of even the elections themselves at political level, you would notice that they come hugely out of communities. And what we know is that for a fact, no medium of communication can surpass the power of community radio in its own area of broadcast. So the issue here lies within how the research is done. And that by right should not actually be stopping how community radio should be sold and how it should be sustained. So I'm going to go back to saying this. The sector itself needs to be intentional about itself. In that intention, there's going to be an element of business planning. And within the business planning itself, we need then to say, how do we as a radio, a community radio sector, include other elements of communities, which is community properties within, because a community radio station, it's like a police station. It's like a clinic. It's a community asset. And in that, we are able to then include other assets of the community, build up one big ecosystem within a community. And then when you sell, we don't only sell community radio, you sell a community, but a station becomes a conduit. Beyond the station, there are events. beyond the station, there are other IPs within communities like your spaza shop forums, your business chambers within communities. You've got taxi owners. You've got kids transportation and on. So those are all little markets within the community which can form part of tribes within a community, and that's how we've been selling communities, but using radio as a conduit. All I'm saying right now is, when we talk about sustainability of community radio, we should not look at the numbers. Let's look at the impact that the community has on certain brands and on itself and even outside itself. Hence, when you see something that happens in Alexandra or in Tembisa or anywhere else, suddenly a minute later, it's picked up on social media, it's on TV, now it's broadcast internationally. And had the communities not had power themselves, we wouldn't even be able to see that content coming out on other national or international platforms. Therefore, I think the conversation goes back to what Gordon said earlier on, to say the numbers are not there, but who does the numbers? And how are the numbers done? Are they favorable to community? And it shouldn't even be about the favorability of a platform. It should be about honesty and the power to be able to extrapolate these numbers. So if the diary format isn't giving the sector the numbers that are credible or believable, then we need to, we are in 2020 and going to 2021, which means technology should form part of a bigger equation of this thing. Groot FM just said during the early days of the lockdown, they reached at least about 1.4 or around that region of engagements on social media, but the actual numbers on BRCSA are saying a different story. Then where is the gap there? You know, it makes it even difficult for people like us to sell stations, because when you approach a client or an agency, the first thing they ask you is, what are the numbers? You know, we know there's impact in that community, but the numbers on BRCSA says a different story. Then it makes it difficult for us to even have sustainability projects and campaigns on even partnerships or commercial partnerships on stations, because clients want numbers. But when you go on the ground in communities, clients receive more than the numbers that they were expecting on air. Why? Because you are now engaging with consumers on the ground, and radio station becomes the biggest element of disseminating this information. So we do have an opportunity from a audience extrapolation research opportunity there. So BRCSA should by right be able to, you know, come to the party and let's unpack this thing and say, where can we better? Because we can't, you know, depend on the way audiences are being extrapolated at the moment. Well, there's a credibility issue there. And
we're just over 15 minutes into the conversation. We're in discussion about the fabric and fiber and the tapestry of community radio in the South African media sector. Joining the conversation is Gordon Miller, Relien Potgieter, station manager from Groot FM in Pretoria, and Zukiswa Potje, as well as Trinity Mokhlame from the Media Connection. Zukiswa, you had something to add to what Trinity was saying?
Yes, certainly. I think first, I liked what Relien was saying about the niche of the community media sector. That indeed, for us, I think we cannot overemphasize the importance of the sector enough, that it evokes a grassroots attitude and a bias towards the free flow of information, and that we see it as encouraging public participation. It does all those things, nation building. It's got localized news, and it talks specifically to the heartbeat of the challenges of the communities. And so that is very crucial to the MDDA. It's crucial for the vibrancy of this democracy in South Africa. I wanted to make a comment to what Trinity is saying about the audience measurement. That I briefly spoke about us at the MDDA building a sustainability model over the 18 months or 2 years, for that matter, that the MDDA is turning 20 in January 2023. And we then decided as the executive and the board that as we move towards reviewing what we've, and looking back at what we've achieved, what are the strengths of the sector, what are the weaknesses, that we should conduct a research, comprehensive research from this year. But that we will do, team, through a consultative conference that I think will have towards July or August, and we'll invite the minister to speak to the sector itself, and we will have build-up webinars towards that. We will have this 2-day consultative conference where we will emerge after it with terms of reference for the research. And I think Gordon said we should define community. And I agree with that, because I think we've been hung up on physical printing, and that has been hampered by the pandemic. So the Mdda and the sector has got to appreciate the technological convergence. We've got to appreciate innovation. In fact, as I speak with you today, we are busy with a digital strategy, a research at the Mdda, which will form part of the bigger research on sustainability. And again, if we speak about the audience measurement and the reach, the numbers have not been able to be accurate, Trinity, because no one has been paying the BRC for that, for the community media sector, for that service. We have not been paying for it. So we met with them last year, and Mr. Whitaker was willing to work with the sector, with us, in coming up and collaborating, in coming up with a tool that would actually serve the community media sector better. We met with him again, I think a week ago, after our conversation got him with you about the process that they're embarking on. And so we've got those talks, and someone would have to pay for that service. Tim, look, we pay for things like your broadcast equipment, we pay for operational costs, we've started paying for Centec, we've started making Centec payments or signal distribution costs, part of the co-funding of the Mdda. So we're doing all those things to ensure that there is some kind of sustainability. But when we go fully into the research, it would be for us wanting to know and understand what are the root causes for the non-sustainability of the sector. I've already said that of the 260 community radio stations, we've funded about 157. And we've not been able to expand or grow that number because radio stations keep coming back. So through the research, we'd like to actually categorize the sector and see who is in dire straits, because we know that there are stations in very rural areas and there are others in suburban areas, and so they can't struggle the same. And so we almost want to put a personalized package for the types of groups that or categories that would come up with. If we use the robot analogy, the red would be the ones that are completely unable to sustain, because the research has told us that there's zero economic activity in those communities. And so we know, and we will almost have an automatic application or annual funding for those ones, so that Trinity does not wait on the queue to apply when we know that he would not be able to pay for stipends and salaries and just maintain the buildings and things like that, operational costs. So we're trying to come up with a model like that that anticipates that this segment of the sector will rely on us on these things, and then this other segment then is able, if again I go back to the robot analogy, it's the yellow category or robot category that we would like to move to the green, because the green would be those stations that maybe just apply for a certain program, and they say I'm running a GBV program, or I'm running this program or this project, and then we just fund ad hocly those programs that they are running, so that we understand exactly what their needs. We know the needs, but at the moment we don't know why Trinity is coming back, why FM is coming back, why Cape TV is coming back 5 times or 4 times and 3 times. We just keep, because we don't want to actually lose the projects that we've already invested in. When they come back, we prefer them and we prioritize them to new ones because we've already invested in them. The other thing that I would like to mention quickly on the advertising is that I think we will put it to the minister in the presidency and to the government at large that I personally feel that there is poor coordination of government advertising spend through the GCIS, that I think we need to strengthen that. It is not that policy or that pronouncement by the president on the 30% set aside has not been formalized, has not been made into law, is not policy, so it's voluntary across government, and I think the GCIS is struggling with that. Thank you.
I think you're in an unenviable position, because the person who sits with the money is always going to be in a tough position supplying things. You touched on one thing, and that was the minister. Gordon, I think it's fair to assume that communications has had poor leadership for many years. Are we suffering now because we haven't had a strong minister in this portfolio for a long time? We only have to look at ICASA, the ICASA board, what's been happening at places like Centec. The Mdda has been in the news over the last 5 years. Do we have a leadership problem high up that knocks onto the guys on the ground?
I don't think that we particularly struggle with that. I think, we're autonomous, we're a self-regulated industry. I think, we've fallen behind the curve in terms of, digital migration and all that kind of stuff, and innovation and bandwidth. But, we used to working within those limitations from a media perspective. So I would be very loath to blame somebody for the state we've got ourselves in. We've controlled our own destiny on this radio thing for a long, long time. So just to pick up on Zuki's point there as well about the funding model, I would like to have an open discussion with everybody, all the stakeholders, including government leaders. But, we need a model which rewards advertisers for engaging downstream, So I should be getting rewarded for my initiatives in producing commercials in isiXhosa or Zulu or Afrikaans and working with community stations. If I, as a media strategist, if I just inherit an English commercial, by definition, it eliminates any other commercial stations that don't take English. So, there's the first problem. I think also we just need to look at the issue of numbers again. Just to clarify, I don't believe in planning by numbers. Okay, I will plan on a business scenario, and I think, Trinity, you made a very good point there about a KFC, etc. I work with the station quite happily with the local retailer, and we'll work out, a value based on the number of shoes we sold or hamburgers or whatever. So those formulas are easy for me, but I'm a small little guy working on my own. If I'm in a big buying house and a big corporate, you've got massive procurement considerations. You have to show what you purchase. That's what I call the 6-prawn theory. If you go into a restaurant now, and I remember we're all going to go to restaurants again sooner or later, and you order 6 prawns, and somebody brings you 5, you're going to ask pretty soon, what happened to the other prawn? If I'm spending hundreds of thousands of rand, I must be able to show procurement, one, why I put that money there in the first place. Secondly, and I think the other level that we need numbers on is, did the event actually happen? Now, in the old days with newspapers, that was easy. I ran an ad in the Sunday Times. I got a thing called a tear sheet. I could physically show my client, there's the ad. So we need another set of numbers as well. And I know that there are companies that do this, companies like Avsteria do this kind of thing. They'll benchmark it, digital footprinting. So I need those numbers at the back end of the transaction. I don't need them to plan, and that's where I think Raleen and Zuki and Trinity are right, that, I can work it out in my own head, where's the community. But I think, just a final point, because I don't want to hog this thing, there are better qualified voices on the other panelists here to talk community. But at the end of the day, community guys have got to understand that it's a competitive world out there. And I had an interesting scenario when I did some work with SABC on Lesedi FM, and as a consequence of that, somebody gave me a really cool Lesedi P cap, which I wore to the airport at Bloemfontein. And I was literally mobbed at the airport by people wanting that P cap. And I suddenly realized this is a brand. It's just a really powerful thing. People really thought this had, I just thought it was a piece of marketing merchandise. And I realized, no, it was a piece of really cool stuff. So you have to up your technical skills. You're competing against top stations. A Kaya FM is technically not qualified as a community station, but if I look at Shop Kaya, Travel Kaya, there's a huge community kind of positioning around the concept of an Afropolitan. So if I choose to think of myself as an Afropolitan, that is my community. I don't need it to be defined by ICASA. So I think there needs to be just an upping of the game generally, and a recognition that if you think you're just competing against Buren Durban and you think you're competing against a station in Maritzburg, no, you're not. You're competing against the Kosi FM. You're competing against Gagasi, whether they're community stations or not.
Raleen, your station is in a great area geographically. You're based in Gauteng, in the capital city. You've got a rich history. And you also have access to a really big business community who can support you and buy advertising. And your station has had good training, and they've had people with really good background in broadcasting and sales. Despite this, the last period of time, especially COVID, has led you to being in a situation where you're not paying your staff their full salaries. So the impact of COVID has been great on you, and it's been great on your business. Is there a way for community radio to mitigate this kind of thing in an economy which is already down? How do you come back from this?
Yeah, I just quickly, thank you, Tim. It's a very good question. Just, I think with community radio station, we've never sold on our numbers before, but we have all our advertising campaigns we sold on our responsiveness of our audiences, and I think that's a big difference. The waste managers of your rand spending on community radio stations definitely less than on your corporate or your bigger stations. But yeah, Tim, just to get back to your question is, it's really been hitting us hard because our success lies with the small, medium enterprises. We don't have government spend on our stations. We don't have the big corporates on our stations. Our success is with the relationship with your SME companies. When President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the second part of the lockdown, it was like almost a handbrake for us. But our income, because our clients the doors has been closed, they can't do business, and they paused a lot of our campaigns. So for the past 2 months, we literally had 85% of our clients, on a pause type of contract, and we had to sit with each client of ours and say, okay, where you at? What's your business like? How can we help? Should we, what plans can we make? Because it's clients that brought us here where we are today, and we can't really, we had to have arrangement with each client individually to say, how are we going to take this forward? So, and thankfully, again, with the level 3, we already have new commitments with our clients, but big clients, still only spending or paying 60% of 100% campaign on air for the next 2-3 months, and then we up them to 100% payment, and that's what we do now. So even if our wheel is still, our wheel starts turning again, but the income is still little, but at least we can see movement with our clients, with campaigns on air, and I'm sure we'll make it. So actually also we just had 3 options. Either we close doors, or we go with a big retrenchment, or we looked at each other at the community radio and said, listen, we have a passion. We're not in this for the money, definitely not. Our presenters aren't in it for the money. We have a love for our community, for our language. We know we serve our community. We're still running projects weekly within this difficult time, and our staff just said, we're in this together, and we decided that we all gonna have the same salary cut. And it has been hard. It's been hard. We've been working really long hours, much harder than before, for little money. But we know we will prevail, and we know we will get through this stronger together as a community radio station with our community as well. So it's once again just the power of the community and the love for what we're doing and the purpose we have as a community station to serve our community in a time like this, to still bring hope, to stay positive. And that's actually what community radio station is about, and what makes it so special is that connection and we have, and the power actually we have to have a voice, and what are we going to do with that? And I think that is why our staff, just said, we know why we're here, we know why we do what we do, and it's actually been an easy decision to make, to say we're going to get through this and we're going to be stronger together as a community, but as a city and as a nation as well. If we look at each other and take hands and do what we do best, is to make good radio and to keep people tuned in and celebrate communities.
There's 25 minutes of our conversation left to go. We're in conversation with community radio. That was Relene Potgieter, the station manager of Groot FM. On Twitter, it's at the SA Radio Awards if you'd like to join the conversation. Trinity, very briefly, a question to you. How much advertising revenue are community stations attracting from their local community and businesses?
The intention, Tim, is for community stations to own up the space of commercialization in their own areas. Basically, the catchment area and the businesses within the catchment area by default should be able to advertise on community stations. Why? Because of the power of locality in those areas. And then when it happens that we look at the provincial landscape and the national landscape, that's where people like the Media Connection come into play, because we speak at chain stores, we speak at group, and we speak at national presence or for many brands, but and agencies. But by right, the Media Connection and other agencies that are selling community radio should be able to own up the space at national level and provincial level. Then when it comes to community stations in their own areas, that's when community stations must take up that space. But this, I'm going to take back to what Usi Zukisa said about the plan that she's been putting together. People like the Media Connection is known in the industry for the credibility and the support that has been putting behind community stations. We've got models in place that we can contribute towards the plan of the Mdda to say, when you grant a station affordability to be on air via equipment and other things, when we talk about capacity building, we should be able to say to a station, this is how we believe it's done. We've been doing it and it's been working for us. Then we then share pearls of wisdom. We then help out at the station level for their supporting teams, sales teams and marketing teams to be able to sustain themselves at local level. So we believe that, you know, the engagement that we will have with the Mdda will also add up to the bigger equation of making community stations stay sustainable in their own areas of broadcast.
Zukiswa, an interesting question coming off the floor is, should we not be investing the Mdda money into training as opposed to bailing some stations out on debt? That's a question too, and you also had a comment on to what Trinity had said.
Yes, certainly, Tim. Training for us is actually continuous. We've got a sub-program or a unit for training and research at the Mdda. Last year, we did a full skills audit of the sector. This year, we've started a strategy on digital strategy research. In this financial year, that's what we're going to do. But we've got, like I've said, we've got SLAs with institutions like your CEDAs, the CETAs, and when we grant you a funding, we also take you a whole process through a whole process of grantee orientation, which is a 5-day workshop. But then beyond that, we train the sector continuously. And one of the reasons we continue with the training is because we know, because the sector is reliant on voluntarism. And so there's just a high turnover in that regard. We lose some of the people that we've trained. And so we continuously train the sector. Every year there are training interventions at the Mdda. I just wanted to add to what Rodin was saying about the unique selling point of the sector, and the fact that because they knew what they were there for, they would not let Groot FM close because of the pandemic. The unique selling point of the sector indeed is the embeddedness of these community radio stations or community media on their communities. And so there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of voluntarism. And so that is the reason why the Mdda launched the first phase. In fact, on the 28th of March, the board of the Mdda approved a 20 million emergency relief. And it was for the reasons that we wanted the sector to actually stay afloat to a limited extent through the pandemic, so that we still have got a sector beyond that. So the question on the training, yes, we provide training and we will always provide training, because for the reasons that the sector continuously grows and the sector continuously loses some of the trained people, because those are volunteers that if they find better opportunities, they leave and they must leave.
Zukiswa, on this matter of funding, are all community radio stations equal at the Mdda, or are some more equal than others? So if there's money to go around for COVID, and there's a call from the Mdda to say, apply, why is it that some radio stations get their money the next day and some radio stations don't get a response to an email?
All right. All radio stations we treat the community media sector equally at the Mdda. Last year, we launched a new funding process or method that eliminated the previous backlog, which was worth more than 850 million. And our tagline for that, when we improved the funding method last year, was that it's got to be fair, it's got to be transparent, it's got to be equitable, right? So what happens is that sometimes the applicants or the projects apply to various email addresses, and sometimes to individuals. If I go to the first phase or the first tranche of the COVID-19 emergency relief, which was the first 10 million we disbursed in April, we received about 135 applications from broadcasters and 141 from print. We funded within 2 weeks 115 community broadcasters and 116 community and small commercial print. I do not remember us not sending back or telling people. In fact, part of our engagement with the applicants was that some had missed to submit some of the requisite applications. But the bulk of the people that did not qualify or did not get the funding were the people that were not broadcasting. Other people I think we had 2 stations that applied that actually had 45 days special licenses. We didn't fund them. We also did not fund online community radio stations. Those are the people that we did not fund. And as far as I remember, we wrote back to tell them that they didn't qualify for the funding. The second tranche we launched on the 25th of May is still under disbursement. We received more than 200 applications. I think we've disbursed about 4 or 4.5 million. And again, that process is strictly slow, because if you were funded in the first tranche, then you must provide a report for you to qualify for the second tranche. And there's also other qualifying documents that we need from you. And so people must try and ensure that they submit as much as much documents as needed. So even now, we go back and forth with applicants to say, you have not submitted this, we don't have a list, because the second tranche is focused on operational costs. We've got salaries and stipends and money to pay the rent, which is behind because of COVID-19, of bond repayments and rates and waters and so forth. So we then speak to people to say, and you have not submitted this document, can we see your lease agreement? If we can't see on your bank statement that you've been paying lease, can you give us proof that indeed you are renting? Those are the things that we look for.
I often feel slightly frustrated by the community radio sector. Trinity, where there's money, in my opinion, there's always going to be a level of corruption. You obviously deal a lot with radio stations, you deal with salespeople, you deal with station managers, and I've been at gatherings where some station managers have arrived in GLAs. It basically looks like there's something from a rap video. Talk to me a little bit about the frustration within the sector when it comes to working with community radio stations to effectively place campaigns, because the money doesn't always flow to the radio station.
Tim, wow, that's a hectic one. But the reality of the truth is that platforms such as community radio stations, Suzuki spoke about it earlier, that, when there's an issue of governance, there will be an issue of obviously accountability. Well, it depends on the personality of the governance in that particular station. Yes, sometimes you find out that some stations are formed by individuals with the intention to commercialize them and treat them as at business level, which is, it's not for me to even comment on that. But by default of what community radio should actually be, community radio should be a community project. And when you look at the name itself, community, in the word community itself, there's a word commune, which is together, and unity. And when the community comes together, with the intention to start up a platform for engagement that has got an educative element, informative element, entertainment, and community development is the biggest element that we need to always be aware of. Hence, purpose-driven businesses like the Mdda Connection will always look beyond commercialization. And I say this because Mezukisa earlier on said the sector doesn't contribute to what DRCSA, the Mdda Connection, does. But because it's not a large amount, it cannot even go further in them helping them to infiltrating all communities to be able to get these numbers. But answering your question, we believe that when communities are aware of what community stations are, even at governance and formation level, they are then able to ask the right questions. Because some businessmen or women form stations because they've got the funding power, and then community stations will be run like a business, which means certain families or certain individuals will benefit more. So communities must also rise and stand up for their projects. In as much as they do for police stations and for clinics and for schools, they should also do for the stations. In that way, it'll create accountability spaces and close the gap of people not knowing what's going on in communities. In that way, financial statements must be made public to the community. There's a lot of things that must happen in a way of reporting back to communities via AGMs or special general meetings and whatnot. But if such things don't happen in communities, people in communities are not even able to be aware of what's going on. So communities themselves must take interest in the stations, and they must probe, they must find out. Information is out there. ICASA website, the information is everywhere for communities to find out and research more. And when they speak and engage with station managers and governance at station level, they would be informed. In that way, they're able to ask the correct questions in this regard. But yes, there is instances where certain people are benefiting more than the station. But remember, some are businessmen themselves who have been running businesses, and they're supporting stations, or they're diversifying their businesses in the communications space. So you don't know whether the money come from the business into the person's coffers, then hence they can afford certain lifestyles, or money comes out of the station into, we don't know that. Hence I'm saying communities are the ones who must be the custodians of licenses, and they must ask the right questions, they must probe, they must they must get accountability for what happens in their special community projects such as radio stations.
We're in conversation about the community radio sector with Zukisa Potje, the CEO of the Mdda, Relin Potgieter, the station manager at Creative M, Trinity Mohlamed, the director at the Mdda Connection, and Gordon Miller, who's a media specialist. Gordon, if you had one piece of advice for community radio stations to attract more business from the national market, what would it be?
Well, I think I'm going to go with two pieces of advice, if that's okay with you. I'm going to steal my time. The first one is, don't underestimate the listener. And I hear what Trinity's saying. David Ogilvy said it 50 years ago, the consumer's no fool, she's your wife. It's something we've always referred to in radio as the power of the dial. If you abuse me, I'll just switch to another station. So I think ultimately we need to trust consumers at that level. But the most important thing that community stations need to do is to pick up on the points that Trinity and Rolene have already raised. As we sit here right now, I'll guarantee you that 99% of television schedules that are played out today will be analyzed against the national audience. Not one of them will be analyzed to look at the regional kind of shift in television audiences delivery. And people are not checking that. So if I run a TV program which is heavily weighted towards Zulu programming, there's a geographical footprint that goes with it. And we need to actually look at those kinds of things. You need to encourage advertisers to get off this national target market mindset and look at the regional play. Start by looking at your television from a regional perspective, and you will see that there are massive fluctuations in audience delivery, which can be filled in beautifully by by community-based radio. And for that matter, and it's something I feel strongly about, we're talking community radio today, community-owned out-of-home, community-owned newspapers, all of those things can fill the gap. So we need to stop advertisers, looking at things at a gross national level. And then the play out of that is also to address an issue which I know it's been raised, that community radio stations often lean on to run free campaigns. You don't need to run a free campaign. You can give a free spot as long as you are being given a share in the upside of the outcome of that campaign. The revenue doesn't have to be ad revenue driven. There are lots of ways of driving revenue. And then the final observation as well is to just recognize that you're not just going to be selling listeners. We have to come up with things like passive meters or personal portable passive meters, all that kind of stuff, which will ultimately measure community radio stations. But you've got to look at the total brand offering itself. And again, it's not a community station in the ICASA-defined sense. But I look at something like YFM. They've got sort of 500,000 listeners, but they've got 1.1 million Twitter followers. You've got to try and sell the total community brand footprint, all platforms, not just listeners. I don't want to buy a radio spot off any radio station anywhere. What I want to do is to create a portal into the world of that total brand offering, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on Instagram, whether it's the radio listener. So be collective, but move advertisers off this national obsession that all campaigns are measured only at national level. It's bollocks.
Relene, a question for you. When your audience tune in, we know that they're listening to other radio stations as well. So they don't define commercial, community, or public radio. How do you ensure that your community radio station can compete with these other sectors, understanding that A, you don't always have the financial resource, and B, you don't have the transmission power? You probably have 100 watts off a tower in Pretoria, where Lesedi is running 10 kilowatts. How do you compete as a station in an environment which is often not level as a playing field?
Thank you, Tim. It's a good question. Well, I just believe that when people tune into Groot FM, or new listeners over the COVID time who has also been tuned in for the first time, they just fall in love with our station. We are focusing on spreading good news. We have a positive vibe on air. We give hope. And, our team is in it for the love of radio. And, I just think that is a massive, a plus for our station, or a positive point is that, when people tune in, they fall in love with us, and they will always come back, even though they listen to other station at another time. And then also our programming ensures that our TSL campaigns is across the board. In whatever we do on our station, we make sure that the TSL, the time spent listening factor, is built into our programs across the board, to ensure that people or listeners tuned in for longer times. And we also try to get our listeners in a journey with us. It's not us speaking to them. They are part of Groot FM. We're part of the community, and we're on a journey together. And I think that's why people, and listeners keep listening to Groot FM, because we're in it together, and we journey together through life. And everything we do at Groot FM, it's very attainable for our listeners to participate also in what we do. And we try to have a two-way communication with our listeners, and they feel part of Groot FM. And I think that's why they will always, when they tune out, they will definitely tune in and stay longer on Groot FM.
We've got 5 minutes to go, so it's almost time to get into a parting shot. And so, Kiso, I'm going to start with you. You sit in a very interesting place in that you're interfacing with a variety of stations. I mean, you've thrown numbers from 260 community radio stations to 157 that you currently work with, but you also get to see insight from the Department of Communications. You'd have insight into what the minister and the deputy minister are talking about, as well as the authority in the form of ICASA. What would your advice and suggestions be for community radio stations in the next year to ensure that they can try and build models of continued sustainability, understanding the framework in which community radio has to operate?
All right. The first thing for me is, in order for the community radio stations to stay relevant, especially to their audiences, is for them to produce high quality content. And as a result, the Mdda is now focusing on funding content generation or content enhancement. We actually need high quality journalism. We need the sector to be professionalized or to be professional. We know that there's community radio stations that continuously play music, but we are saying, please, we are prepared to assist to generate the correct content, high quality content, but content that involves your communities and talks to the issues and challenges of the communities which the stations serve. The other issue for me is just the consistency of the community radio stations. That you must know when you switch on Vibe FM or Rise FM or Uku FM, you must know what to expect. Like we do when we listen to the public broadcasters or other commercial radio stations. So that level of high quality of professionalism, quality content, we must use innovation, technology and innovation. And those are the things that we are going to be assisting the sector to improve on as we move towards 20 years of celebration for the Mdda's existence.
Trinity, as a parting shot from your side, your company works a lot with community radio, the campus sector, guys in far-flung rural areas, but you also get to interface a lot with the public sector, trying to tap community radio into that. What's your message to government about community radio in the next year?
My message to government is you need to be intentional about communities. Remember, when you talk to communities via stations, you are talking to your constituencies. And these are the power. This is the power that you have as government. The more you communicate with people, you are able to even correct messages that have been, said about you. Fake news can be diffused via correct communication, but you cannot expect community radio to be sustainable when you don't spend money on community stations. And when you spend money on community stations, from even the inception itself, hence I said earlier, we also need to be mindful of the fact that if you incubate a station from a licensing point of view, equipment point of view, we also need to then say, how do we train you to stay sustainable? Because there's a local economy in every constituency. How do we empower you as a station to sell yourself and also help other attributes within the community, SMMEs and other formal and informal businesses within your community to stay sustainable? So that 360 relationship within community itself can help communities stay sustainable. If a woman can, a certain lady can sell magwinya for 20 years and take her kids to varsity and build a beautiful house in the homelands, we can do it at community stations because we've got Stockfells there, we've got Shebins, we've got a lot of businesses in locality that can be commercialized. And the more we engage at commercial relationship with these stations are sustaining themselves, but they're also sustaining businesses. So government should, and hence I said to Mezuki so earlier on, we can help. We've got the academy. We sell community for a living. We can help communities learn how to sell themselves better because we've been doing it, and we are willing to come to the party and say, this is how we also want to give back as enterprise development.
Relin, my last question to you. You have an opportunity to go to the Department of Communications and meet with the minister and the deputy minister. As a station manager of a community radio station, what's the one message that you would like to share with the Minister of Communications?
I would just remind him actually about Mdda's quote. One of my favorite sayings that he said is, when you speak to a person in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you speak to him in his language, it goes to his heart. And that is actually my wish for South Africans, is to get education in their home tongue, to listen to community radio stations in the home tongue, because there's something special about us, our cultures, and just to remind them to look after communities, as Trinity has said. because that's really where fellowship is taking place, where people can encourage, where you can make a difference. We don't have to raise funds, millions of bucks for one person who needs cancer treatment in America. What you can do, and that's what we try to do at Groot FM as well, is to, to do stuff that our listener can do as well, to just take flowers to the lady up the street when he's sick, or something like that, to build a community, and to look after our communities, and spend time and to educate our communities is actually, like Trinity said, very important to me, and to speak to the languages of people in home tongue. That's quite important factor for me.
It's the real essence of community radio. Gordon, in 30 seconds, as we start wrapping up this panel, what's the thing that excites you about community radio in South Africa?
That it exists and that it continues to exist against the odds, which means that if we get the ducks flying in the right kind of formation, we can really make it thrive. But quick comment to advertisers: don't plan at national level and hope that your campaign will trickle down in a balanced form to the community level. Plan at a community level, whether it's geographical community or language or cultural community, and then aggregate that to the top and report at a national level. And then to the community media themselves, recognize, and I put in a blog once, I used the example of an atom. An atom consists of the nucleus, which is the community itself. Then there's electrons and protons, negative and positively charged. You'd think that they exist in opposition to each other, but they don't. They aggregate together, they work together to create, to hold the atom in place. Whether you're community radio or community out of home or community newspaper, if what Trinity says is correct, and I believe it is, and you're selling the community, then you should be working together to sell the community. Make a bigger pie out of the community and have a slice of a bigger pie. Don't just become the sole spokesperson for that community.
We've been in conversation with Zukisa Potjet, CEO of the Mdda, Rolien Potgieter, Station Manager at Groot FM in Tshwane, Trinity Mohlamed, Director at the Media Connection, and Gordon Miller, who's a media specialist. My message to community radio stations is I've spent 12 years in the sector, or within the community radio sector, and it's tough. I get it. It's tough being a community presenter, it's tough being a salesperson, and it's tough working on the coalface of the legislation. But it makes a difference. And I think the thing we must always remember is we exist because of audiences. And if at the end of the day, we've done something to empower our audience and to make our community stronger, community radio has done a great thing. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for joining us. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for taking the time out of your day to share in the conversation. The conversation continues now at SA Radio Awards on Twitter. And until we meet again on this platform, turn up and tune in.